Hello, everyone. Welcome to Talking Logistics, where we have conversations with thought leaders and newsmakers in the supply chain logistics industry. It's my pleasure to welcome to today's program Jordan Kass, who is the VP of Management Services at C.H. Robinson, and we're going to talk about why supply chain innovation matters in a fast changing world. Before we get started with the conversation, I just want to remind all of you that part of our goal here at Talking Logistics is really to engage you, the audience, as part of the conversation. So if you've got any questions along the way for Jordan, feel free to submit a question via the submit a question button, or you can type it in the chat, and I'll keep an eye on it. And if any good questions come up, I'll try to weave them into the conversation. For those of you that are joining us as a guest, just a reminder, you do have to register first in order to ask a question. So with that, Jordan, welcome to the program.
Thank you.
Well, let's start with kind of the premise that I know that you've brought up in many of our conversations, in some of the writing that you've done on your blog, as well as some of the presentations that you give, and that is that the world is not only changing, but it's changing faster, right? And that's kind of the point that you like to make. What do you mean by that? Can you give us some examples?
Sure. So I think first off that it's no secret technology is having a huge impact, and it's a big part of that central premise and that argument that we're making that not only the world is changing, but it's changing at an accelerated rate, and largely due to technology. We've seen the rise of social media, the proliferation certainly of mobile devices, right? There's 7 billion people on the planet today. So I love this stat. 50% of the world has a mobile device now. So that means 3.5 billion people are walking around with a smartphone. So I think those technologies have had a huge impact, and in particular, it's associated with supply chain and the requirements for great supply chain performance. The idea that a store isn't necessarily a physical space, but a virtual space, and we're ordering on demand via our devices. I think as a result of that, it's clear supply chains need to be faster and they need to be more agile. So you got other factors. I mentioned there's 7 billion people on the planet, but when we're talking to shippers about strategy, they're talking about population growth as a growth strategy. So by 2040, you're talking about 9 billion people on the planet, and it's not in places necessarily where the populations are today. It's in new places, in emerging markets. I think also related to the way the world is changing is this idea of the mega city. That's a topic that we've written and I like to speak about on a regular basis. But overall, what people are saying is that more and more people are migrating to cities. A lot of that has to do with the idea of access to resources, right? It's kind of a fundamental building block of society, and that's creating greater population densities in cities. So the mega city, if those people in the audience are familiar with the term, it's cities with populations over 10 million people. There's just more and more of those cities. So we're talking about places like Shanghai, Mumbai, or New York City. And then maybe one last technology, Adrian, to reference that I think we all need to keep our eye on in supply chain. And certainly this one's emblematic of the speed and of change, and that's 3D printing. That technology in particular, I think, holds tremendous potential for us as supply chain professionals. That technology, I think, really could change the landscape.
Yeah, those are all great examples, Jordan. I think if certainly we're living in this social mobile era, right, where we all have smartphones, and we as consumers are really kind of changing the world in many different aspects, and changing the way business interacts. You brought up the mega cities and what's happening with population shifts and urbanization, and just looking at the world more globally. And then when you have these potentially, disruptive technologies like 3D printing, um, uh, you know, the more I look at that, when I first heard about it, actually it was many years ago when I was an engineer and I was doing, prototyping. I was always a big fan of it, but it was always very much just to make little prototypes. And I've been shocked to see how quickly and fast that technology is evolving. And whereas I thought it might not have an impact for many years, I think it might be sooner rather than later. So, looking at all these changes, everything you talked about, what impact is all this having on supply chains? I mean, have the rules for success changed as a result?
So I think the clear answer is yes. At the highest level, right? And just to keep it simple, supply chains are longer and they're more complex. Many supply chains, when you take a look at them, and in particular, let's talk about the speed of change, right? If you compare today's supply chain to the supply chain of 10 years, so 10 short years, and you look at the changes, I think it's astronomical. Many supply chains, they're just not linear anymore. They're multi-channel and they're multi-party, and I'm sure you've got a very bright and educated audience. I'm sure most of the folks on this webinar have heard the term, the omni-channel supply chain, which I think is really just emblematic of the types of changes that we've seen. And those changes are creating need for different success criteria, or the way that we would define the requirements of what you need to do to be successful in the modern day supply chain. Global visibility, I think, is a really great example. I rarely visit a company and ask about symptoms, and I don't hear something to the extent of we really need to get to a point where we have global visibility. Greater business intelligence and analysis tools, I think, leading to better decision making that drives your strategy. Uh, the ability to handle complex multi-leg shipments, right? In today's world, in these global supply chains, you have to have that capability. And then I think companies are focused on automation. Um, and overall, that shouldn't be surprising, right? Companies today need to innovate faster, and in particular, faster than their competition, if they're going to adapt to these changes in the world.
I want to get to that point about innovating and innovating faster. But you brought up a topic that I thought was interesting because it comes up a lot. I mean, in all my years in the industry, you continuously hear shippers, manufacturers, retailers talk about visibility, yeah, right? And the challenge that is. And in fact, I had a conversation a few episodes ago with one of your colleagues talking about total landed costs, and visibility was a key foundational capability in order to do total landed costs. I mean, I'll ask you the same question I asked Chris back then, which is, why do you think that continues to be a challenge? And are we getting closer to being able to provide, and for companies to be able to have greater, more and faster, more reliable visibility?
I think unfortunately, I think it is still a challenge. The reality of it is, it doesn't have to be uh, a challenge. I mean, 5 years ago, 7 years ago, 8 years ago, the idea that you could have a single platform, a global TMS, and I think it's one of the innovations that's really been in the forefront over the last few years. But the global TMS is here, and it can provide that level of visibility. So I think it's just a matter of organizations assessing their priorities, and in particular, I do know many companies these days are running so lean, and it can often be hard for them to garner, in particular, IT resources. But in terms of the capability and the solution, I think it's arrived.
Yeah, certainly. I think you're right. I think the technology is there, and you can argue it's been there for a while now. I think the hardest part is perhaps some of the the process changes or some of the organizational pieces, particularly when you have very distributed supply chains with many suppliers and trading partners and transportation providers across multiple geographic regions in terms of getting them on board or plugged into that technology or working with them to kind of get visibility, not just with the tier one partners, but tier two, tier three. I think that continues to be the area that a lot of companies still are challenged with.
I agree. I agree. No, and I think sometimes just the idea of implementing a global TMS is very daunting to customers or shippers because uh, they've gone through perhaps what wasn't the best experience deploying an ERP and trying to standardize their business in that way. I think a lot of them still have a little bit of a hangover effect and a little bit tentative about some of these larger scale implementations.
Well, let's talk about innovation now, because I think that gets to kind of the heart of the conversation here. So if you kind of agree with the premise that the world is not only changing but changing faster, does that mean that companies have to innovate differently today, than in the past? And if so, how so? And can you give us some examples of how companies are innovating their supply chain logistics processes, kind of in response to managing, these rapid changes?
Yeah, I mean, I think in terms of do companies have to innovate differently? I mean, I'm going to answer that politically. Yes, yes, and no. When it comes to innovation, I think now more than ever, it's critical that you innovate in a way that is linked directly to your organizational strategy and actually have a process to ensure that the innovation is linked to your organizational strategy. You need to know your identity, who you are today, and I think what elements of your business that you kind of need to transform for the future. I also think you need to know your competitive landscape, which obviously should be a part of your strategy. But I like to reference two case studies. I think you can look at the case of Amazon versus Borders Books, or you can look at Blockbuster versus Netflix. Blockbuster and Borders. And again, this gets to the idea that the world is changing faster too, right? Because let's let's talk about Blockbuster and Borders. Just 10 years ago, they were really successful businesses. Everyone shopped at Blockbuster and everybody shopped at Borders, but just 10 years later, they're out of business. And I think to a large degree it was because they didn't innovate. They didn't pay attention to the competitive landscape. Amazon changed the book market with innovations. They had the online bookstore and the ebook, and Netflix changed video rentals, forever. Amazon and Netflix, what they had in common is they both use technology to innovate and change the landscape. Uh, Borders and Blockbuster didn't recognize that the world was changing and it was changing faster, and their technologies were, or their competitors were innovating with technology, and now they're out of business. So I think there's a real lesson there for all of us. In terms of supply chain, I think one of the best innovations in the past few years has been the rise of the global control tower. Uh, and we just talked about this, right? Today, many companies are beating their competition and they're taking advantage of their competition by implementing global transportation management systems and the associated core processes that I think can provide the outcomes we were talking about earlier. The elements like the global visibility, the business intelligence tools on a global basis, automation, uh, the ability to handle complex multi-leg shipments, or the ability to handle local requirements like language and documentation, tax, and currency. All of that, just to name a few.
Yeah, it's interesting that you mentioned control towers. I was just at the MIT Crossroads 2013 conference a couple of weeks ago, and I actually wrote about this on the blog yesterday. But Tom Linton from Flextronics, the chief procurement and supply chain officer there, kind of ran through his top 10 supply chain trends. And I think number 4 on the list, I forget the exact number, but he did reference control towers as being, among his top 10 supply chain trends. So it's interesting that you kind of, brought that up as well. Um, as it relates to something like control towers, or even more broadly to innovation, I mean, you brought up, Blockbuster and Borders, and kind of some of the challenges. I think, some of the challenges is that uh, there's this fear, if you will, of this disrupting your existing business, or there's resistance to change, right? Because you may have a well-oiled machine already, and kind of innovation, comes with risks. Comes with, you're not going to get it perfect the first time. Um, how do you overcome that? I mean, how do you see the best companies overcome kind of the fear of failure, or dismissing something because it's relatively new, or it's a small competitor, and they don't have any market share yet or whatever, and you're just going to say, that's just a fad, you know, and not really kind of seeing it as a real potential, a threat to the business.
Well, I think, fortunately or unfortunately, probably depending on where you sit, uh, when I'm working with organizations, some of them, but not all of them, the ones that are leading have a very specific uh, approach and blueprint for how they innovate, right? And it's sort of this idea and a culture that innovation needs to be a planned event. And I just don't think that enough companies in today's landscape, right? There's certainly a lot of ones who are doing it really well, but I think you could think about it this way, Adrian. If your organization doesn't have a blueprint or an approach, a science around how you're going to approach innovation, then I think that should be a red flag. I think that you're leaving yourself exposed because, again, the world's changing, and it's changing faster. And those two examples we just discussed in great organizations at one point in time, Blockbuster and Borders is a perfect example. You don't have a way of kind of overcoming that fear that you were talking about.
Well, let me take a kind of a contrarian view here a little bit, or kind of something else to think about. A few months back, I wrote a posting, titled, "Forget innovation, focus on execution," right? Where I made the case that companies can get as much, and perhaps even more benefits from just executing better than going after the next big thing, the next new shiny thing. Because there's a lot of companies that I find that are just having a tough time just executing some fundamental, best practices that have been known for a long time, right? And rather than again, if you can't execute kind of existing best practices, what makes you think that you can, execute innovative new processes? What are your thoughts on that? I mean, do you think that companies do have to strike a balance between innovation and kind of looking towards the future and taking risks and trying new things, and trying to enable best in class execution?
So first off, yes, I think that the whole trick is to strike the right balance. Uh, that's what I meant earlier when I said you've got to link innovation directly to your strategy, and you have to understand, your identity. Um, so it is about balance, in my personal opinion. Having said that, and relative to the blog you mentioned, can you just execute better? If I were to answer that question, I would say, Adrian, if you have the right strategy and you understand your competitive landscape, and you're already kind of have developed a strategy that has an eye on where you need to be, in order to beat your competition, then I think yes, you can execute that really great strategy, and innovation is a part of it. Um, just keep paying attention to technology and just keep paying attention to competition and have rigor and, and science around how you're going to analyze those two components and continually to update your strategy. Maybe one last comment related to that. I really like a lot of the work that MIT is doing with scenario planning. I'm sure you're familiar with it, but and other organizations are doing some of that work too. But what I like about it, and I know that it's typically rooted in supply chain resiliency, but what it does is it forces a discipline where you look at different scenarios of the future. And so I think, yes, you could use those for designing a more resilient supply chain, but I also think you can use it for innovation. And so again, I really applaud them and the work they're doing there.
Yeah, no, I think great points. I mean, I think what I heard you say is that innovating and executing well are not mutually exclusive, right? So, I think if you kind of follow what you just talked about in terms of putting it within the context of your strategy and keeping an eye out on the competitive landscape, where you want to be, where you want to head to, what your customers are leading you toward, right? I think it's execution and innovation kind of are part of the bigger puzzle there. Obviously you work with a lot of companies, working at C.H. Robinson, and um, what do you see as the role of a logistics service provider in terms of helping companies innovate faster and succeed in this rapidly changing world? And within the context of innovation, does that mean that the way 3PLs and customers work together also needs to innovate? Now, you need to innovate the way those relationships are established and managed. What are your thoughts on that?
Sure. So I guess let's begin with the first question. I think that yes, the role of the logistics service provider or 3PL is critical to enabling innovation on behalf of shippers and their supply chain partners. Uh, Maybe we can take a look at it from this angle. I think right now, if we were to poll our audience and say, if you're a shipper, raise your hand if you feel like you've got the right technology and enough resources to achieve your strategic plan. I'm willing to bet that if we ask those questions, people would respond and say, I don't have the right technology in my hands today, and no, I need more resources. The economy is tough. Companies are running lean, and I think as a byproduct of that, some, not all, but some are putting investment and innovation to the side, which can be a big mistake. Again, if we look back at those case studies I mentioned. So given that, I think 3PLs or logistics service providers, we are uniquely positioned to help companies by complementing the resource gaps by providing expertise, and also the technology gaps, of which the two of those can really help drive innovation. And I think your last question there was, how do 3PLs and shippers need to work together in order to do that, and is that right formula in place? And so I guess for me, there needs to be the right guiding principles in place that's going to foster uh, innovation. The rules of engagement need to be focused on win-win relationships. I don't think that a shipper should expect a 3PL or a logistics service provider to invest if it's not a mutually beneficial situation or there's not a clear return for both organizations. So I think that win-win philosophy needs to be in place. But at the same time, I also think that the shipper absolutely should hold the logistics service provider or the 3PL accountable, and then certainly the logistics service provider and the 3PL should be accountable, hold themselves accountable to bring new ideas and innovation to the table. That's part of our fundamental role.
Yeah, great point at the end there. And in fact, I've been a big fan of vested outsourcing, or the vested model that, Kate Vitasic and Carl Manroad and the folks over at the University of Tennessee have, put forth, for the past few years. And actually, we did an episode on that early on in the season here of Talking Logistics. So I think that's a model, that would benefit and lead to better relationship between shippers and 3PLs, and to help drive that innovation. And in fact, I mentioned the top 10 list that Tom Linton over at Flextronics put together, and that was actually his number one trend, was kind of more collaborative relationships, win-win relationships. I think he called it no zero, because I think a lot of folks approach these relationships as a zero-sum game. Someone has to win, someone has to lose, and so he kind of viewed kind of a move toward these win-win relationships, and really looking at opportunities to identify a bigger pie and how to get there for all the parties involved. Kind of thinking from an ecosystem standpoint, as opposed to thinking quote unquote selfishly or individually. I just want to remind our audience members that we're kind of coming up to the time here. I've got a couple of questions for Jordan left, but if you've got any questions as I go through these final two questions, please post them via the submit a question button, or via the chat, and if we've got time, I'll be happy to weave them in. So Jordan, as a way to kind of wrap up, I mean, how do companies know if their supply chain processes and capabilities are aligned with kind of today's fast changing world? I mean, to put it differently, how would you complete the following phrase? You know your supply chain is built, to meet today's challenges and opportunities if what?
Well, I think I mentioned a lot of them, and the outcomes that I mentioned earlier, particularly if you're a global company, you're going to know if you're successful if you have global visibility, if you have the right business intelligence tools to make better decisions that drive your strategy um, forward, if you have the ability to manage these complex multi-leg shipments and give your users features like language, or the ability to handle different currencies and all the complexity that has to do with the modern day supply chain. Um, and then I think if you were to look at a checklist, a high level checklist of what the modern day supply chain needs to be in order to be successful, I would say it needs to be faster. It needs to be more agile. We need to have smarter supply chains than we have in the past. And again, I feel like with the innovation of the global control tower, I think that those outcomes are very real and very achievable.
Great. And then, one last question here, which is a question I like to ask all my guests, because one of our goals here at Talking Logistics is really to allow young professionals and students the opportunity to kind of engage with experienced executives such as yourselves. So for anyone who's either listening in today, or watching this on demand down the road, I always like to ask, what recommendations would you give to students and young professionals that are thinking about pursuing a career in supply chain and logistics, or currently just starting their career, to help them kind of pave a more successful path, right? Particularly in the context of everything we talked about in terms of where supply chains are heading, and where the world is heading, and so forth. What advice would you give to students and young professionals?
Sure. Well, I think that's a question I get asked a lot. So you give me a layup here at the end, but I think that a few things come to mind. I think that I would say make sure you have a personal development plan. It sounds simple, but it's really important that as an individual, it, I like to say you got to take ownership of your own career and evaluate where you are developmentally, uh, what skills you have today, but more importantly, what skills you need tomorrow to get to your goals. Again, we get to see a lot of organizations, and I it, it is surprising that there are many organizations out there that have not necessarily distilled that kind of basic people development uh, component of ensuring that employees have a personal development plan. So I believe strongly in that. Uh, I would tell uh, I would tell everyone to get as many different experiences as you can early in your career. We talked about the fact that the world is changing and it's changing faster. You've got to have broad and deep experience to solve the complexity of the problems that exist today. So you need to have those experiences under your belt. And then the last piece of advice I would give is uh, this world is about relationships. Period. End of story. And I think that if you want to go far in your career, you need to be a great team player. Uh, you want, I would encourage everyone. You want to be a part of a company that has great values, and once you understand that value system, make sure that you're instilling those values in your day-to-day work, because that's going to be your roadmap for success, right? That's what the company is saying is these values are what we want our employees to embody. And too often, I think those values as a component of the strategy sit to the side, and they should be front and center. That's your blueprint. Um, so be a great team player. Understand the importance of relationships. Very simply, great people and great teams build great businesses.
Great, Jordan. Great advice. Very thought-provoking conversation. I think we just obviously scratched the surface in a lot of these themes, but I think hopefully, definitely got the wheels in my head turning. Hopefully, it did the same for the people listening in today. So I want to thank you for making the time to be with us today.
Thanks for having me. It's always a lot of fun to talk to Adrian Gonzalez.
Great. Thank you, Jordan. And I want to thank all of you who joined us today. We didn't get any questions, but certainly, as you kind of think through kind of the conversation, if you've got any questions for Jordan or comments, feel free to go to the blog, talkinglogistics.com, and find the episode, and you can post a question or a comment there, and I'm sure Jordan will be happy to, answer it down the road. Um, while you're there, check out the kind of the upcoming calendar. We've got some great guests lined up. So certainly look forward to seeing all of you back in a future episode of Talking Logistics. Again, Jordan and everyone, thank you for joining, and look forward to seeing you all again next week. Talk to you soon. Bye bye.